Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there and welcome to Brazier, fast-paced news from 4 until 6. I'm Alistair Stewart, covering for Colin today. In the next hour, a lively, fast-moving couple of hours ahead. We will be going live to the House of Commons as soon as the Prime Minister gets to his feet within the next half hour or so for the first time since his police fine. We're expecting an apology and an attempt to reset the agenda. But how will those MPs that you're looking at the moment, if you're with us on television, if you're listening on radio, it's a wide shot of a really, really packed House of Commons, listening to Priti Patel talking about the Rwanda refugee plan right now. And also importantly for all of us, how do we save our high streets? Sir John Timpson, the boss of the great Timpson's shoe repair and key cutting shops, will be joining me live to talk about new plans from the government to force landlords to let out empty shops. And as the polls suggest that many of you have begun to move on from Partygate and are much more concerned about the cost of living crisis, we'll ask a former advisor to Number 10 if Boris has read the room better than his opposition and many in the media. Now, in the last few moments, the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, has announced that he will allow a vote that could see Boris Johnson investigated for, and I quote, misleading Parliament. Now, with me throughout the show, I'm delighted to say, is commentator and podcast host Lynn May, and we will be joined, both of us, by a host of other guests who really know their stuff. You will not miss a thing. 4 to 6, but first, your latest news headlines, and here we go. Polly Middlehurst.
Al, thank you. The headlines, as you've been hearing, MPs are to vote on whether the Prime Minister should be investigated following claims he misled Parliament over parties held at Downing Street during lockdown. The Speaker of the House, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, says he received a number of letters requesting the debate, including one from Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer. Sir Keir insists Boris Johnson did mislead Parliament when he said all COVID rules had been followed. The vote will be held on Thursday.
My role is to decide whether there is an arguable case to be examined. Having considered the issue, having taken advice from the clerks of the House, I've decided that this is a matter that I should allow the precedence accorded to the issue of privilege. Scheduling the debate for Thursday will, I hope, give members an opportunity to consider the motions and their response to it.
That was the Speaker of the House. Well, as we said, Boris Johnson is due to face MPs shortly, addressing the Commons for the first time since he was fined for breaching lockdown rules. He's expected again to make a full apology. We'll bring you the latest on that here on GB News. Well, the Prime Minister's also been speaking to the US President Joe Biden and other world leaders about the current situation in Ukraine, talking about tougher sanctions against Moscow. He's already warned his cabinet that Ukraine is in a perilous position, as he put it, despite recent setbacks to Russian forces. He believes the war is entering an attritional phase, which could last several months. Former heavyweight champion Vladimir Klitschko, who's the Kiev mayor's brother, told us Ukraine won't surrender.
There's no option. It's about death and life. It's about defending and standing for your home, for your families here and against this aggression. And you know what? We need to stop Russia in Ukraine.
Here, the Home Secretary says access to the UK asylum system should be based on need and not the ability to pay people smugglers. Priti Patel defended the proposal to send refugees to Rwanda by saying the new bill is consistent with all of the UK's domestic, international legal obligations. Under the new partnership, people will be given up to 5 years of support, including healthcare, education and employment training. The Home Secretary said the bill will deal a major blow to people smugglers and their evil trade, as she called it. A man has appeared in court after 2 police officers were threatened with a knife in London yesterday. The 29-year-old has been charged with attempted grievous bodily harm and possession of a blade following the incident at Horse Guards Parade in London. He's been remanded in custody and will appear at Southwark Crown Court next month. So, energy bosses are warning the government they must intervene to prevent what they say will be a horrific winter for many people. At a committee hearing, the chief executive of Scottish Power explained how his company received 8,000 calls to its helpline last week from families struggling to pay their bills. Keith Anderson is calling for a government deficit fund, reducing the bills of those in fuel poverty by up to £1,000 from October this year.
Come October, that's going to get horrific, truly horrific. And it's got to a stage now where I honestly believe the size and scale of this is beyond what I can deal with. It's beyond what I think this industry can deal with. And I think it needs a massive shift, significant shift in the government policy.
Well, a little bit of good news. Train tickets for off-peak travel this spring are going on sale at a significant discount. It's being called the Great British Rail Sale. And the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, says more than 1 million off-peak tickets will be up to 50% off this month and next. The sale, thought to be the first of its kind, is part of a bid to help passengers with rising costs of living and encourage people to let the train take this train. This is GB News. More news as it happens. Now, for the moment, back to Alistair.
Polly, thank you very much indeed. Our top story in less than half an hour. The Prime Minister will be addressing the House of Commons for the first time since he was given a fine by police for COVID rule-breaking at number 10. So the moment Boris Johnson gets up, we will be cutting back. Can we have a quick look at the House of Commons now? Can we do that? I don't know whether we can or not. It's live television, so I suspect we probably can do. It is a very, very crowded House, and there it is. Now, fascinating. That's Andrew Mitchell, who's a Tory Member of Parliament and one of the sharpest critics of the Prime Minister, but also a really sharp critic. If you're watching on television, you'll see underneath Andrew, it says Rwanda Migrant Plan. He is a former Overseas Aid and Development Secretary of State, so undoubtedly putting the boot in. Now, back to me, if you'd be so kind. The reason he's speaking is because about 10-15 minutes ago, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, got up to make a statement about her Rwanda plan, and Yvette Cooper for Labour responded and retaliated it. Now, throughout the next 2 hours, I'm delighted to be joined here, live in the studio, by Lynn May, blogger, vlogger, commentator, voice of balance, and you're often on Colin's programme, so it's a delight to meet you. And we were chatting before we came in that sometimes on these great parliamentary occasions, the warm-up act doesn't quite make it. Blimey, Priti Patel was on fire, and back came Yvette Cooper. Can I just play the Yvette Cooper clip first, and then I'd love to hear what your view is on it? We don't have it. OK. Priti got up and justified the Rwanda plan, saying that it was a good plan to stop people drowning in the Channel, etc., etc. Yvette Cooper for Labour got up and said she's just offering cover for the Prime Minister's law-breaking. Now, this is what Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, had to say.
We've seen over the last week, Mr. Speaker, this unworkable, shameful and desperate attempt to distract from the Prime Minister's law-breaking that the Home Secretary should not go along with, because she is undermining not just respect for the rule of law, but also her office by providing cover for him.
It's pretty tough stuff from Yvette Cooper there. Do you think she got it right?
See, this is the thing. It's difficult because I think that Britain has been crying out for something. So anything such as this, which is a huge plan, people are going to jump at it and say, yes, at last something's been done. However, I just think there's too many holes in it. And I also think that we underestimate migrants that are so desperate to come to the UK. And I actually think, and it'll be interesting to see in a couple of years, how much it's actually going to cost the taxpayer, because I think they're just going to come straight back. So even though it sounds amazing, even though, you know, it seems like finally something's happened, I just think it's a poor plan, if I'm honest.
Yeah, but if you've got a government whose backs are up against the wall, sometimes a poor plan is at least a plan. And what Tom Harwood was saying a little earlier on GB News was that the majority of people out there just want something done, either to protect our borders, that's one argument, or to stop those poor souls who are genuinely innocent drowning in the Channel. Either way, this at least is an attempt to do something about both of those things.
I think it's just a good PR stunt by the government because, as we know, if we look at the plan, it's only going to be 500 individuals and we're seeing thousands come in.
Sure.
So what is it really doing? Why isn't there more emphasis on the safe countries that they arrive at first, like France? Why isn't there more emphasis on tackling the actual traffickers that are ensuring that these people get here?
Does it matter, in your view, as an observer of these matters and a commentator upon these matters, that you can articulate that? And I had a Liberal Democrat on my programme at the weekend who could articulate that. And I even had Edwina Currie saying, well, yeah, I can see some merit in that argument as well. Yvette Cooper was banging on about cover for law-breaking. She wasn't saying what Labour would do.
Well, this is the problem with Labour oftentimes. They like to criticise anything that the government seems to do without alternative measures. And that's why I think, in terms of credibility for the Labour Party, OK, if you're going to come and criticise the government, at least have an alternative. And they don't. They rarely do. OK.
Well, thank you for those opening thoughts. I shall be coming back and bashing your ear as the next couple of hours unfold. As I say, that remarkable exchanges between Yvette Cooper and Priti Patel were merely the amuse-bouche, the opening course of what is going to be an extraordinary 2 hours. You won't miss a thing by staying with us here on TV and radio, GB News. For example, we can cross live now to Westminster and get the latest update from GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood, who is a man renowned for having his ear to the ground either outside number 10 Downing Street, but today just across the road from the House of Commons. What's the latest that you're hearing, Tom?
Well, yes, it's an incredibly busy day in Parliament, Alistair. I've been dashing in and out of that building, getting exactly what's going on. Of course, we've been listening to the Home Secretary and the Shadow Home Secretary have a knockabout over the Rwanda refugee policy. But also, just before that, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, announced something pretty extraordinary, which is that the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, has been enabled by the Speaker to put down an amendment in the next couple of days. It will be voted on Thursday, to put down a motion, I should say, as to whether the House believes the Prime Minister should be referred to the Committee on Standards. This is, of course, over the Partygate affair. Now, this vote will take place on Thursday. It's while the Prime Minister will be over 4,000 miles away in India, but it's going to be a really interesting temperature check of the Commons. How many Tories will vote with opposition parties to refer this matter for another investigation? We know that there's been the Met Police investigation. We know there's been the Sue Gray investigation. Well, now a Standards Committee investigation, a powerful committee, could be on the cards, and they could be pulling up some evidence that they may well make public as well. But of course, the Prime Minister, importantly, speaking at 4:30 as well. He'll be addressing that as well as the other issues of the day.
Sure. 2 points on that, Tom. Absolutely spot on. You know even better than I do that motion and vote on Thursday is utterly meaningless stunt stuff unless a significant number of Tory MPs vote for it, and they probably won't do, which leads me to my second question. Why have the whips summoned every single Tory member of Parliament to an emergency meeting at 8 o'clock tonight?
Well, that's exactly the question that the Prime Minister will be wanting to gauge the temperature of his MPs at 8 p.m. this evening in one of the committee rooms, up on the committee room corridor in the building behind me. MPs will crowd in to one of those rooms in one of these extraordinary meetings of the 1922 committee, but also of ministers as well. The Prime Minister will be taking soundings from his party, most likely, in terms of what they can really how the whips can behave when it comes to asking MPs what to do when it comes to that vote on Thursday, because there'll be many MPs who think that, well, if the Prime Minister has nothing to hide, then surely yet another investigation, albeit led by the rather vocal Labour MP Chris Bryant, who chairs that committee, why would they be afraid of yet another investigation? That may well be the argument of some Conservative MPs, and we know that this is an intake of MPs that has been more rebellious than most. These 2019ers are more likely to be willing to stand up against party leadership, and of course the big beasts on the backbenches of the Conservative Party. We know that people like David Davis, people like Theresa May, people like Damian Green, these people who have held high offices in the past, are unlikely to return to the cabinet anytime soon. Potentially they may well be rebelling as well. The Prime Minister will want to take note of what his party is thinking before telling them what to do.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. And David Davis actually was just speaking before you joined us, and I think Theresa May spoke before him as well in the Priti Patel Rwanda debate. So we'll ferret around. If you hear what they said, do let us know when we come back to you. For the time being, thank you very much indeed. Lynn May still with me and listening attentively to what the great Tom Harwood was saying. Just before we came into the studio, you said to me, would you hold the vote or not? And I said, yeah, I would, because I don't think enough would defect. What's your view?
I think that they're pretty solid. I think that the Cabinet and I think his MPs are behind him 100%. I think that they're looking at the tone of the country in terms of the Ukraine crisis, the cost of living, and they want stability. I don't necessarily agree, but I think that they are pretty unified in their stance.
When you look at the field of play, and I've never asked you this, so I haven't asked you anything before because it was the first time that we've actually met and worked together, that one of the other arguments that is often made now, particularly after Rishi Sunak had his difficulties, and indeed his wife's difficulties over taxation, is that one of the most powerful assets that the Prime Minister has right now is there isn't an obvious alternative.
That shouldn't be a good enough reason to just accept. You know, most Conservatives support and are in agreement with the rule of law. No one should be above the rule of law. He's broken the law. So I'm still quite shocked at the tone of everyone, you know, pretty much being behind him. Yeah. And I initially liked Boris, even though I had a lot of criticism for it. But this is something that I just can't support, or otherwise it sets precedent.
I want you to hold all of those thoughts and reflections on law, because I'll be delighted to be talking a little later on in these 2 hours to a QC about precisely the legal aspects and dimensions of it. But for now, Lynn, thank you very much indeed. Now, I mentioned our next story at the very top, and it's one I'm really thrilled to be doing, because it's a challenge many of us are more than aware of. The challenge is, how can we save the great British High Street? Well, the government's come up with a new set of powers that will be unveiled in the Queen's speech in the next few weeks. Those plans aim to force landlords to let out vacant retail units. You see them every day. If you go down to the town, you see places that are shuttered up, and British Home Stores, Debenhams, whatever it might be, all sorts of businesses less well known that have simply failed, and they sit there empty, ugly and doing nothing constructive. Those plans are to be announced, as I say, in the Queen's speech next month. 1 in 7 shops is currently sitting empty, according to the latest figures that come from the British Retail Consortium. And I'm told that the northeast of England is the worst affected area, with fully 1 in 5 shops closed. Shops that have been empty for at least 6 months could be rented out by force. If the owner can't let the shop, then councils will step in and hold an auction and offer them to the community groups and even small businesses. Well, there are very few people that I know who know more about how retailing is done properly and well and how the high street functions than the great Sir John Timpson, who is the owner and chair of the shoe repair chain Timpson's and chairman also of the government's High Street Experts Panel. John, great to see you. Is this just a reflection of how more and more of us shop now, online, home deliveries? We don't go to the high street as much as we used to.
It's an acknowledgement that we've got to look to the future of the high street, and there is something that needs to be done in terms of what the properties that are closed, obviously, which are contained here, but actually generally the whole property portfolio on the high street needs a good, close examination. Now, you're talking about the closed units, and I suspect there's a large number of those closed units which will never be shops again. Partly because business rates, unless they're reformed, that's another stumbling block. Even if the rent was nothing, you still got to pay the business rates. But also the fact that, frankly, there are too many shops in most towns. And what we need to see is a complete realignment of what the property is doing in those towns, so that it's not just retail. They're not just properties for shops, they're properties for the town, and they should include lots of other things like hospitality, entertainment, leisure, medical services, and indeed housing. In some of those places which are empty shops, like some of the Dagenhams already, should become places that people live and put more energy back into the town centres.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I want to put one important point to you, John, and I bigged you up in the introduction because I've known your work for a long time and admired it, but also, and I read your son's column in the Sunday Times as well. So this is a political, philosophical point. In your view, is it right for the government, albeit via local councils, to in effect take control of an asset that is somebody else's, somebody else owns that lease, they own that freehold, and just because they can't find a viable tenant, then the government steps in, takes it away and says, we'll sort it out? That strikes me as being philosophically wrong.
I feel some sympathy the way you're putting it, but when I was involved in the high street study into what the future of the high street was going to be, I coined a phrase of upside down government, and I think the government role here is to create the impetus for change which is needed, but that change should be run locally, and we need inspirational local leaders to make sure it happens. But we start with a big problem that the town centres, the shopping centres, were formed as they are now basically in the 1970s, when we had quite a lot of shops then, and then they added a few more shopping centres in the centre. And then beyond that, we've seen all the supermarkets develop. We've got retail parks all taking a lot of the business away. And then we bring the internet shopping. And it's not surprising the result of that is we've got too many retail properties. So that all needs sorting out. But there is lots of positive in this. I mean, in fact, the effect of lockdown, the effect of the whole COVID thing has not been anything like as dramatic as the doom-mongers were suggesting. We're now seeing a lot of new retailers coming back into towns, which is great. And some towns, by reorganising what they do, bringing more housing into the centre, getting other services other than retail in there, are showing a bigger footfall. So we're seeing where it should be going. And I think that this is, I don't think it'll make a massive difference, but I think this is government trying to give a bit of a nudge to get the whole retail shopping in town centres pushed into the right direction.
The other thing that crossed my mind when I knew that you and I were going to be having this conversation, and our biggest town nearby is Winchester. We're kind of between Winchester and Alton, and you're represented there on the high street in Winchester. And one of the great things, there's not a plug for Timpson's because you don't need it, you're doing perfectly well, is that if I'm going in there to get a watch repaired or to get a key cut, I have a natter with someone who's quite nice and informed, and I talk to them about the work you do in giving ex-crims, haircuts and suits to go and get a job with my charity hat on. We have good banter. I then meet up with my son, who lives in Winchester, at what can only be described as a pop-up cafe. It used to be something else, but this guy now runs a cafe. It's fantastic. Great coffee, good food, and again, good experience for the customer. So your sector needs to put its thinking cap on, even more, I might suggest you, John, than Her Majesty's government.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is no doubt, and our experience shows this, that the better service you give customers, the better you do on the high street. And that's one of the reasons why people are persuaded to go shopping than go on the internet. And in fact, it's a much greener thing to do to go shopping. In one journey, you buy 10, 12, 15 things that you could have ordered on the internet and cause 15 journeys of a van coming to your door. So that's a consideration. But, I mean, we're bound to be on the high street. We've got to do our business through shops, because you can't get your key cut like for barbers, you can't get your hair cut on the internet. So anyone in that service sector has got to do what is the most important thing for shops to do: give a great service, but also give really friendly service to customers. Yeah. And the way you do that is to hire really positive personalities who are great to be with and look after customers in a friendly way.
Couldn't agree with you more. I hope every other retailer is listening to that. Great wisdom there, as always, from you, John. Good to see you, and thanks for finding time for us this afternoon. That is Sir John Timpson, who is the chair of the High Streets Expert Panel and also the boss of the great Timpsons. It's about philosophy, even more, I would argue, than politics and economics. And goodness me, he was on the money, wasn't he?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it sounds controlling. I think it sounds arbitrary. I think how it's been...
What, you mean the government plan?
Yeah, I think...
No, I meant him when he was saying...
Oh, yeah, he's
better
fantastic.
Customer service,
yeah, of course.
make it a good experience, a one-off
definitely.
to save petrol.
Yeah, but I just don't like how the message is being conveyed. Again, this is a Conservative government, and it's supposed to support property ownership, it's supposed to support autonomy with business, and that doesn't sound like it. It sounds like, you know, they're going to be forcing landlords, especially at a time when it's quite difficult to obtain the yield, the income from leasing those properties out. I think more needs to be done in terms of subsidiaries. Conversations, has there been a consultant take place? And I don't think there's much conversation around that. Sure. How about working together with the landlords to say, OK, this is the situation, the high street is dying, you're not going to benefit, we're not going to benefit, what can we do, as opposed to we're going to force? And
make it even easier for people like pop-up businesses who are just going to try it.
Or incentives for driving
restaurants,
in.
coffee bars, bookshops,
exactly.
Brilliant. Lynn, thank you so much for those thoughts. Much more to come. We are with you, what is it now? 26 minutes past 4. GB News, TV and radio. We are waiting for the Prime Minister to get to his feet. That should be fairly soon. And you're watching Alistair Stewart here on GB News TV, online and digital radio. Coming up, it's less than 15 minutes, I'm now told, before the Prime Minister is expected to face MPs for the first time since his Partygate fine. So stay tuned to see that live, and then great commentary on it afterwards. First, a quick break.
Tonight on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity. That's the question. That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Inching towards 4:30. A very warm welcome back to you all. This is Alistair Stewart on GB News TV and radio. In the coming few minutes, quite literally, we are expecting the Prime Minister to brief the House of Commons. There is the House of Commons on there. That's Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. As you all know, she made a statement which began, I think, probably about half an hour ago about her Rwanda plan, as it's become known, for dealing with immigration and illegal immigrants crossing the channel. Her defence is that something needs to be done, and the real offence is people drowning as they make that attempt. Other people say, well, we just want to make sure that people who are entitled to be here get here, and Rwanda falls short on that score. That's the Democrat Unionist Party there. So that will carry on. And the moment that finishes, however, come back to me, and then we will go straight back to the Chamber of the House of Commons. But standing outside the Chamber of the House of Commons, I am delighted to say, is a good friend of mine who has worked inside Number 10 and knows how that curious place behind her works better than many people I know. It's Joanne Nadler. And great to see you. You've been listening, I know, a little bit to what Priti Patel and Yvette Cooper were saying, and those interventions from quite high up the food chain, people like David Davis and Theresa May. But what do you sense will be the atmosphere and the dynamics in the House of Commons when the PM gets up, eyeballs Sir Keir Starmer, and knows that the men and women who have his fate in their hands are sitting behind him? What will that be like?
Well, I think perhaps perversely it may not be as bad for the Prime Minister as it might have been a couple of hours ago before the news broke about this intervention from Sir Keir and the prospect of a vote, I believe, on Thursday regarding maybe referring the Prime Minister to the Common Standards Committee. Yeah. And I think
Joanne,
what happens in the Conservative benches
forgive me for interrupting, merely to clarify between ourselves for folk who are kind enough to be listening to our conversation on radio or on television, and that was the judgment, because we ran it at the top of the programme, but that is the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Keir, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, granting a debate, but on Thursday, on whether or not the Prime Minister should be referred to the Committee on Standards over Partygate, and that was moved by Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, but granted by Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons. That's the only reason I interrupted, Joanne.
No, that's absolutely fine. And yes, you're right. I mean, that's what I'm referring to. And I think that may have an effect that perhaps Sir Keir wasn't planning on for the backbenchers on the Conservative side, because when they see an existential threat to the party, when they see a threat posed by the other side, if you like, they do tend to pull together. So I think it's now going to be more difficult in a way for those criticisms and those critics of the Prime Minister to come forward.
Can I put something else to you as a very experienced chess player when it comes to the game of politics? It just struck me that having Priti Patel versus Yvette Cooper on Rwanda, which is contentious within the Conservative Party and contentious within the country, was not a bad idea either. That also takes some of the venom out of the atmosphere, because people like David Davis, Theresa May, Andrew Mitchell can have a good go on that and then clear the decks for the Prime Minister's statement?
Well, that would have been a very shrewd bit of parliamentary planning for the afternoon, yes. But I think there's also another aspect to highlighting that debate this afternoon, and that's for the Prime Minister to be able to say to his backbenchers, look, we are now doing something in a material sense, regardless of how controversial it may be in some quarters, but we're doing something about an issue that has been causing great concern to many of those voters that Boris Johnson has been particularly successful with in terms of his ability to reach out beyond the Conservative Party's natural constituency. So I think in a way he's trying to bolster his role, his specific role as leader of the Conservative Party. And perhaps to remind
totally agree with you. And going back to the era when we, as it were, we first knew each other, the John Major era, and John faced his difficulties. He went into the Rose Garden at Number 10 and addressed people like John Redwood and the Flapping Coat Brigade, as he referred to them on Brexit. And basically said, put up or shut up. What Boris Johnson seems to be saying is, I'm the guy to see this through. I'm going to see through immigration. I'm going to see through the economy. I'm even going over to Europe, to India to try and do stuff. Leave me where I am. I've work still to do.
Absolutely, and in a sense that is the better part of his defence. I think this sort of slightly mealy-mouthed attempt to defend him on the basis that he didn't necessarily know that something was a party or wasn't a party actually doesn't really wash. It doesn't hold a great deal of authenticity to it, even if it may actually be true. It just doesn't sound terribly convincing. So I think what the Prime Minister is right to do is to really position himself as this world leader and as the only leader now in the sights of the Conservative Party. After all, over the last few days, we've seen his main potential rival, Rishi Sunak, really rather blow up his own chances, I think, of being able to effortlessly walk in as the alternative leader. So Conservative Party members, Conservative Party MPs will be facing the reality that if they do hasten the departure of Boris Johnson, what then happens? What comes next?
Absolutely fascinating. One of the other bits of the defence, and whether he says it in the next 10, 15 minutes or not, we don't know, because curiously there haven't even been those secret squirrel briefings from Number 10, which we're both familiar of. Even on the morning of the budget, secret squirrel briefings go on. Nothing on the content of it, other than simply the guidance. It will be similar to his apology interview that he gave on the night that he was fined. But the suggestion that he will make hay over the war that is raging within Ukraine, that struck me as being one trick that wasn't that clever, in the sense that everybody in the House of Commons, whether it is Ed Davey for the Liberal Democrats or Keir Starmer for Labour, have said, look, we all stand four square behind supporting Ukraine. It's not a Boris Johnson policy, it's a House of Commons policy.
I think that's right. I think it's very important that if the Prime Minister does invoke the war in Ukraine, that his use of language, his tone is very measured, because I think it could slightly rebound on him in a negative way if he's appearing to try to use this in a political way. And I think that would be inappropriate.
Yes, I agree with that. Joanne, hold that thought for a moment. My director has just told me that Sir Keir Starmer, so let's just cut back visually, if you're kind enough to be watching us on television, and if you're listening to us on radio, we'll talk you through it. But can we cut up the House of Commons now? So that folk watching on television can see that. Joanne is still there. Lynn's still here with me in the studio. So that's the scene in the House of Commons. That's the Labour side. The reason we did that is to say that Sir Keir Starmer has now arrived and will be there. That's Priti Patel just pretty well finishing off, looking across at the Labour members of Parliament, with Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, sitting to her right. And we will cut to that live with audio as well the moment moment the Prime Minister gets up. But just to let you know that Sir Keir Starmer has now arrived and is in his place to respond to whatever the Prime Minister has to say. Joanne, is there anything fresh that Sir Keir can say? Because he's already done the bit. Why is he still there? That line we've heard more times than I've had hot cross buns at Prime Minister's questions. Is there anything fresh in Sir Keir's armoury?
Well, the Conservative Party, of course, will be hoping that there isn't, and the potential for freshness might come over the next few days and weeks, depending on what is in the Sue Gray report and whether or not the Prime Minister has to pay any more fixed penalty notice fines. But as to what he can say or do this afternoon, I mean, not that I want to give him any advice, but I think, you know, his strongest territory really is on this issue about, you know, people who make laws shouldn't be breaking laws, and the fact that so many members of the public were deprived the most basic human rights, really, during the lockdown period. They weren't able to attend funerals. They weren't able to visit elderly and sickly relatives in care homes. And I think that, you know, for him to focus on that in juxtaposition to the fact that parties were going on in Number 10, whether or not the Prime Minister knew exactly all the details, that to me is really his strongest suit.
Yeah. Will they have played war games on this in Number 10? You've been there when similar situations have pertained, as we all know that they do before PMQs. You know, Starmer's likely to say this and the SNP are likely to say that, and the Lib Dems, if they get called, are likely to say X, Y and Z. And one of the points they might play on war games...
Well, if they're doing their job properly.
Well, okay, it'd be a bit tricky if they didn't. But I'm going to stick my neck out and say I think everybody now knows that many people suffered during the lockdown and that many people weren't able to attend funerals and even final moments with people. The cynical bit of me says we know all of that, and that hasn't cut through yet, and it's not going to cut through now.
Well, I think that I still think it's the strongest suit that he has in terms of what he says this afternoon. It is this point about rules were broken by people who were making those rules. It's one rule for them, it's one rule for us. And I do think that from Labour's point of view, that particular mantra, it's one rule for them, it's one rule for us, is actually pretty strong. Not least because, you know, it has a very strong air of authenticity about it, but, you know, focused on this subject.
All right. Joanne, you stay right where you are, and I'm telling you and also the people who are kind enough to listen to our conversation or watch it here on telly that Priti Patel is just drawing her remarks to a conclusion. So plug in the earpiece and make sure you can hear exactly what the Prime Minister and Sir Keir are saying, and then we'll have a further conversation. And for the time being, Joanne Nadler, thank you very much indeed.
I will do.
Absolutely intriguing there from Joanne about what the best hand is for Keir to play in these circumstances. You, about 10, 15 minutes ago, were still saying it's trust, it's law and order and breaking the rules.
Yes, I stick by that. And it's so bad because Keir could wipe the floor with this if he was a really good opponent.
He's had so many chances.
So many chances, and he's boring, he's not hard-hitting, he doesn't show strength. Like she said, you know, one rule for them, another rule for us. He could really drill that home. All of the adverts that the government had with people at home, ill, you know, you can't see loved ones, it's easily done by the Labour Party, and they're just so weak, aren't they?
I'm not sure that I would disagree with that. I just have to tread quite cautiously and balance these matters. But no, I spent a lot of my 2 programmes at the weekend on Rwanda, including interviewing the spokesperson for the Rwanda government about genuine charges that are made against them about gay rights and human rights and civil liberties and free journalism. But the thing that really does get me is I think in a functioning democracy, it's good to be able to attack the government, absolutely spot on. But if you're in opposition, you've got to say, they're a bunch of losers, and here's precisely what we would do. We didn't hear it from Yvette on Rwanda. Whether we hear it now from Sir Keir Starmer or not, I don't know.
I doubt.
But, am I right in principle that you've got to... it's not good enough just to take pops at people.
Exactly.
You've got to say this is what we would say.
And that's what they struggle with.
Final question, and don't take this amiss at all. I am considerably older than you. Is this also a generational thing? Do young people even more want to just get on with their lives and get back to university, not pay such high interest rates, or get back to school and complete their studies and get ready for examinations? Is it oldies who are more concerned about this stuff?
Do you mean in terms of...
Getting uptight about the fact that Boris Johnson broke the rules, got done, got fined and said, I'm sorry, we all make mistakes, move on. Do younger folk get as aerated about that as older folk do?
Yes, we're all very angry. For the simple fact that a lot of younger people, especially in entertainment, they had to pay £10,000. Many people from working class backgrounds who really struggled to make ends meet. And here we have a Prime Minister that's paid 50 quid. Don't worry about it. I want to stay in my job, and shushing us about it, while others literally had to pay huge fines and struggle. And that's the issue with a lot of young people. It's like, you want us to follow these laws, you want us to abide by these regulations, and you can't even do it yourself.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Right, you're watching Alastair Stewart and friends here on GB News television and radio. The time is 3:45. What will be happening? I'm not going to bother cutting back to the House of Commons because I can tell you that there will be a shuffling in the Speaker's chair. The rules and regulations of the next 20 minutes will be explained by Sir Lindsay from the Speaker's chair, and then up will prompt the Prime Minister, and then after him up will pop Sir Keir Starmer. We'll be live for that, so don't go away. Quick break first.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're watching Alastair Stewart here on GB News, TV and radio. Thank you very much indeed for being there. We have an hour and a quarter still to go, and Priti Patel is one of those politicians that I'm just beginning to draw my comments to a conclusion, and a comment that perhaps needs a little explanation. It may take a little longer. But anyway, I invite, as always, your comments on this programme, and we all love to hear what you think here on GB News, TV and radio. Christine sent us an email commenting on the earlier Rwanda debate that was going on. Priti is on fire in the Commons, but about time, says Christine. Trevor, commenting on Partygate, says, am I the only one who remembers Starmer and his team condemning Boris Johnson for the very thing that they also did, i.e. have a bit of a party? And if you're on social media, you'll see there's a similar debate and row going on at the moment about the First Minister in Scotland. Elaine sent us an email Mail, Boris's address tonight will be back me or sack me. On their worst day, I think the Conservatives will be here for a while. That's not to say that they're perfect. It's because the opposition seems so weak, which was exactly what Lynn May was saying just before we took that break. Barry, on that conversation I had with the great Sir John Timpson, laws to force this, that and the other. Do we live in a democracy or a police state? Agree with you on that, Barry. That's exactly the point I put to Sir John. Isn't it time that the Tories change their name? They're beginning to frighten me. Well, I think you mean Conservatives. I think Tories, funnily enough, were a slightly different group. That's going right back into history. You have to look that one up to see the point I'm making. Nick also joins in on the High Street plan. How will underfunded councils afford this? Raise council rates. I don't think it's going to cost them a great deal to do it. What I was unhappy about, and I think Barry is as well, is the idea that if a shop isn't capable, the owner of a shop isn't capable to get a new tenant, then the council can step in and put it up for auction, and the person who's prepared to pay the most amount of money gets it. And it seems to me that that's actually a law and order and ownership issue. But thanks for that, Nick. Annie comes in on the high streets too. Gosh, this has really got you going. In my village, there's a dentist, a vet, a snooker hall, a pub, hairdressers, pharmacy and GP. All the essential shops, butcher, baker, greengrocer, florist, co-op and more are well used. We have no empty premises at all. A good mix like this works well. Scale that up for larger high street areas. Brilliant point, Anne. The only thing I'd add is that to underline that you say in my village. Maybe it's about the size of your community that makes that a distinct possibility. We have a petrol station and a little mini hall where various gatherings take place. But goodness me, small communities are great places to live. Let's go back to the migrant crisis with Peter, who says it's good to see Priti Patel giving Yvette Cooper some stick on the Rwanda project. Yes, Tony Blair and Yvette Cooper did open the floodgates on these migrants, and our government, says Peter, now has the job of stemming the flow. Max says, why not open up safe and official routes to claiming asylum and bring heavy punishment to the people smugglers. And again, Lee May, my friend who's here throughout the 2 hours of this programme, made the similar point about safe and official routes. And I personally agree with that, as it happens. But thanks for that, for joining in, Max. Martin on Twitter, this signals the end of decades of do nothing. Surely we can all agree on that being a good thing. Do nothing has made many people smugglers very rich, and many economic migrants have died. That, Martin, is essentially the argument that Priti Patel was putting earlier on. Another viewer says, do nothing. We've obsessed about and vilified migrants for years now, hence Brexit and this government. A final quick one from Rob via email. Not only should Boris go, but he shouldn't be allowed to claim his fine back on expenses. Rob... I don't think that's likely, and I don't think the independent body that looks after expenses is likely to go along with that either. As I said during that, Lynn May is still with me. That's an interesting flavour. We can chat as much as we want about what you and I think and the opposition, but that's the authentic voice of GB viewers and listeners on radio. And you must have been quite chuffed that a lot of it echoed with what you were saying on the two big stories of the day.
Yeah, like I've never denied that something definitely needs to be done. And for a lot of people, even from, let's say, my community or ethnic communities that have lived in Britain a long time and haven't actually lived in their home countries reflect that too. Where I lived in Barbados, we had an issue with illegal immigration. It's not just a Western thing. So something definitely needs to be done. It's just what makes sense. And I just am very interested. I'd like to come back to you in 2 to 3 years and see if this actually saved us money and it lowered the amount coming in.
Do people need to know how much it will cost as a programme before it goes forward? Because it strikes me that in the middle of it, there are various technical things that may or may not go right and it may or may not work. As you say, come back in a couple of years and assess it. But for the Conservatives, and this is the point that was made about here, they're not Tories, they need to change their name, to launch what is a very substantial programme, and the senior civil servant in the Home Office couldn't sign it off, not because he disagreed with it, but because the cost-effectiveness of it couldn't be proved. And yet, at the moment, we're spending £1.5 billion a year on putting people up in hotels. Yeah, we definitely need to know how much it will cost. And not just, like I said, it's only going to be 500 people a year.
So we're still going to have to pay for all the others that come in. And essentially, the reason why we're saying we can't have so many people coming in is because there's a massive weight on our NHS, our housing, and things of that nature. So if we're not making a saving because we're complaining about those issues, then what is the point of this?
Yeah. The other argument that I've seen made against it, and I don't think that this has been made as clear or as widely clear as it ought to, is that there's no outcome from the Rwanda plan that allows somebody to come back here if they are absolutely bona fide, fleeing in fear of their life, not an economic migrant or anything like that.
Yep.
They go to Rwanda, they are assessed, they're either sent back to where they came from or they're welcome to stay in Rwanda. There's no UK solution.
But this was my question, it's slightly veering off topic. We're not going to provide all of the visas for people coming in from Ukraine. So my question is, for those who come here and we say, you know, we can't provide you with a visa or stay, are they going to be sent to Rwanda? And then if they are seen to be in need to come back, are we going to allow them to come back? And the tone is very different when it comes to those from Ukraine. So I'm a little confused by what you said as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to pick out this point here, which was the email that said, Trevor, who said, am I the only one who remembers Starmer and his team condemning Boris Johnson? No, sorry, I beg your pardon, that different one. That it was open borders, which is what Priti Patel accused Yvette Cooper and the Labour Party of standing for, goes right back to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who eventually had to say British jobs for British workers. This ain't new. It has been around for a long time and left unattended.
Well, historically, the Labour Party was supposed to be for the working man. It was supposed to be for, you know, people that came from working class backgrounds. And if they're going to say, let's just open our borders, how does that protect those people? So I think Labour need to be careful on this.
Thank you very much indeed, Lynn May, on that. Now, I have to be totally honest with you, and at the moment, the House of Commons is not doing what I suggested, because I'm being told that Priti Patel is taking rather a longer amount of time to conclude her comments and respond to all of the points before the Prime Minister gets up and has his say. As you know, the Prime Minister has claimed that he was unaware that his birthday party in the Cabinet Room was in breach of the COVID rules. The gathering was reported in the Times newspaper and other outlets in some detail 2 days before the police decided to fine him for it, which seems to suggest that he did indeed think that it was permissible. Otherwise, why tell the newspapers we did this and we didn't think there was anything wrong with it? So how clear was the law at the time of the gathering? I said at the very beginning of these 2 hours that we'd be picking through the legal points, and I'm delighted to say that my next guest is a barrister and indeed a specialist in election, public, commercial and employment law. And that's Francis Hoare. Francis, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. I said to my producer, the one thing I wanted to get clear with you from the outset, that even in the context of Partygate, ignorance is no defence in the face of the law.
Yes, of course, that's right. And it might be said less so for the Prime Minister, who was responsible for passing this unprecedented panoply of regulations based upon under the Public Health Act, using a part of the Public Health Act that nobody who passed it ever thought could be used or should be used for regulations of this type. But yes, that's right. Ignorance is no defence. That said, these are, as you said in the introduction, in your introduction, particularly complicated laws, and they're laws that have received very little judicial scrutiny, particularly so far as the sort of nitty-gritty of how those laws are to be interpreted and what exactly they mean. Yeah. So there is a considerable lack of clarity.
That second point is intriguing. So these were plans, rules and regulations dreamt up within Downing Street, published, supported by a huge PR campaign that was crystal clear, telling people never, ever bend the rules. But you just said it wasn't adequately examined, either judicially or perhaps even technically. So it was bad law.
Well, the far more important point, in my view, And I think this should be in the view of anyone who is concerned about the true constitutional ramifications of what happened in the last 2 years. The far more important point is that these regulations were ever made at all. All our pandemic planning envisaged that we would have an entirely voluntary response to the pandemic, perhaps with the exception that we would legislate to ban very large gatherings, specific gatherings, and things of that sort. We had a very detailed pandemic plan. We also had the Public Health Act 1984, but amended in 2008, which made specific provision for justices of the peace to have specific regulations about individuals who were or may be infected. It also envisaged that the Secretary of State could make legislations which affected people who may be infected. Nobody, as I said, nobody, when this went through Parliament in 2008, ever thought or ever suggested that it could be used to do this extraordinary, unprecedented, and I might add, almost totalitarian form of lawmaking. Sure. Nor was this scrutinised by Parliament at all. It wasn't scrutinised by Parliament in 2008, as I said, and none of these regulations were scrutinised before they were made. They were made by the ministerial pen without any scrutiny in Parliament whatsoever, and Parliament didn't get to even consider them for about 6 weeks.
Such an important point, and I'm just going to put two things to you for a final comment, and that is, despite the fact that the Civil Service and Government Support Acts are awash with lawyers, not least the Treasury Solicitor and all the way across, and there are parliamentary draftsmen and women who look at the legality of all of this, that and the other, and the House of Commons is bursting at the seams with barristers and solicitors and the rest of it. I mean, that is such inept government.
Yeah, not very many good lawyers in Parliament. That's part of the problem, the professionalisation of Parliament. I'm afraid to say it might be an unpopular point, but I think there should be more good lawyers and good professionals who are not professional politicians. And if there were, I think we would have a more independent Parliament, and we would have a Parliament more able to scrutinise what is going on. So that's a general point. But yes, these were not scrutinised. They were given barely any attention by Parliament when they came before it. When they came before it, some of the regulations have even been amended. And in fact, the House of Parliament, House of Commons and the House of Lords scrutiny committees and other committees have gone into this in some detail.
Francis, always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much indeed for your wisdom and experience. You keep in touch with us, and for the time being, thank you very much indeed, Francis Moore, barrister and commentator. What an intriguing contribution. The time is 20 seconds past 5. You are with Alastair Stewart here on GB News, TV, online and digital radio. Prime Minister still to come. Don't go away. Hello and welcome. If you've just joined me, Alastair Stewart, standing in for Colin Brazier here on GB News TV and radio. And thanks for sticking with us if you've been here for the last hour while we wait for Priti Patel to finish and wait for the Prime Minister to get up and make his first statement to the House of Commons since being hit by that fine for breaching COVID. If you've only just joined us, you missed the most intriguing discussion just a moment ago with a barrister who said whatever the Prime Minister did or didn't get up to, it was a rubbish set of rules that were barely examined by people who really knew what they were talking about. So we'll have more on that, plus the Prime Minister's live statement. But before all of that, there he is. Is that a live picture? That's a library picture. So we will cut to the live picture of the Prime Minister at the moment that he's ready to go. So only a third of the civil servants coming into the office regularly. Can government function with large numbers of staff still working from home? We'll be discussing that. And the high-tech missile systems that the UK is sending to Ukraine. Can they help defeat Vladimir Putin and support the Ukrainians even further? I'll be speaking to a former military general and intelligence expert. Still with me for the second hour, I'm delighted to say, is political commentator Lynn May, with many of her views on that and other matters. But we're both also poised and waiting for the Prime Minister to speak. Before we get to that point, one other crucial thing that we always offer you here at GB News, and that is the very latest news headlines. And here with them is Polly.
Alistair, thank you. The top stories this hour on GB News. The Prime Minister is due to address the Commons for the first time since being fined by police for breaching lockdown rules. Earlier, MPs were given the right to vote on whether Boris Johnson should be investigated following claims he misled Parliament over parties at Downing Street during lockdown. We can take you to the House of Commons now to listen to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
During the Easter recess, I will come to Ukraine in a moment, since I've just left a virtual meeting with President Biden, President Macron, Chancellor Scholz and 8 other world leaders. But let me begin in all humility by saying that on the 12th of April, I received a fixed penalty notice relating to an event in Downing Street on the 19th of June 2020. I paid the fine immediately, and I offered the British people a full apology. And I take this opportunity on the first available sitting day to repeat my wholehearted apology to the House. As soon as I received the notice, I acknowledged the hurt and the anger. And I said that people had a right to expect better of their Prime Minister. And I repeat that, Mr. Speaker, again in the House now. Let me also say, not by way of mitigation or excuse, but purely because it explains my previous words in this House, that it did not occur to me then or subsequently that a gathering in the Cabinet room just before a vital meeting on COVID strategy could amount to a breach of the rules. I repeat, that was my mistake, and I apologise for it unreservedly. I respect the outcome of the police investigation, which is still underway, and I can only say that I will respect their decision-making and always take the appropriate steps. And as the House will know, I have already taken significant steps to change the way things work in Number 10. And it is precisely because I know that so many people are angry and disappointed that I feel an even greater sense of obligation to deliver on the priorities of the British people and to respond in the best traditions of our country to Putin's barbaric onslaught against Ukraine. Our Ukrainian friends are fighting for the life of their nation, and they achieved the greatest feat of arms of the 21st century by repelling the Russian assault on Kiev. And the whole House will share my admiration for their heroism and courage. Putin arrogantly assumed that he would capture Kiev in a matter of days. And now the blackened carcasses of his tanks and heavy armour litter the approaches to the capital on both banks of the Dnieper and are smouldering monuments to his failure. Having pulverised the invaders' armoured spearheads, the Ukrainians then counterattacked, and by the 6th of April, Putin had been compelled to withdraw his forces from the entire Kiev region. Britain and our allies supplied some of the weaponry, but it was Ukrainian valour and sacrifice which saved their capital. I travelled to Kiev myself on the 9th of April, the first G7 leader to visit since the invasion, and I spent 4 hours with President Volodymyr Zelensky, the indomitable leader of a nation fighting for survival who gives the roar of a lion-hearted people. I assured him of the implacable resolve of the United Kingdom, shared across this House, to join with our allies and give his brave people the weapons they need to defend themselves. When the President and I went for an impromptu walk through central Kiev, we happened upon a man who immediately expressed his love for Britain and the British people. And he was generous enough to say, quite unprompted, I should reassure the House, I will tell my children and grandchildren they must always remember that Britain helped us. But the urgency is even greater now because Putin has regrouped his forces and launched a new offensive in the Donbass. We knew this danger would come. And when I welcomed President Duda of Poland to Downing Street on the 7th of April and Chancellor Scholz the following day, we discussed exactly how we could provide the arms that Ukraine would desperately need to counter Putin's next onslaught. On the 12th of April, I spoke to President Biden to brief him on my visit to Kiev and how we will intensify our support for President Zelensky, and I proposed that our long-term goal must be to strengthen and fortify Ukraine to the point where Russia will never dare to invade again. Just as our foreign policy must look to the long term, the same is true of this government's domestic priorities. And as we face the economic aftershocks of COVID and the consequences of Russian aggression, that is above all in tackling the impact on British energy prices and on consumers and on family bills. And that's why we're spending over £9 billion to help families struggling with their bills. We're helping families to insulate their homes and reduce costs, and to end our dependence on Putin's oil and gas, and to ensure that energy is cheaper in the long term. We published on the 7th of April a new strategy to make British energy greener, more affordable and more secure. We will massively expand offshore wind, and in the country that split the atom, we will build a new reactor not every decade, but every year. This government is joining with our allies to face down Putin's aggression abroad while addressing the toughest problems at home, helping millions of families with the cost of living, making our streets safer and funding the NHS to clear the COVID backlog. My job is to work every day to make the British people safer, more secure and more prosperous, and that is what I will continue to do, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
What a joke. Even now, as the latest mealy-mouthed apology stumbles out of one side of his mouth, a new set of deflections and distortions pour from the other. But the damage is already done. The public have made up their mind. They don't believe a word the Prime Minister says. They know what he is. As ever with this Prime Minister, those close to him find themselves ruined, and the institutions he vows to protect damaged. Good ministers forced to walk away from public service, the Chancellor's career up in flames, and the leader of the Scottish Conservatives rendered pathetic. For all those unfamiliar with this Prime Minister's career, this isn't some fixable glitch in the system. It's the whole point. It's what he does. It's who he is. He knows he's dishonest and incapable of changing, so he drags everybody else down with him. The more people debase themselves, parroting his...
Order! I can't hear what's being said because you're making it up. Mr. Babrickan, I'm all right. Keir Starmer. What I would say is, I think the leader said dishonest. I don't think that's an appropriate word to be. I think I will make. We don't want to talk about breaking rules, do we? I don't think that's a good time to discuss. I just say, I think if he just withdraws that and works around it, I'm sure that with the knowledge that he's gained over many, many years, he can use appropriate words that is in keeping with good temperate language of this House. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I respect that ruling from the Chair. The Prime Minister knows what he is. And so he drags everyone else down with him. The more people debase themselves parroting his absurd defences, the more the public will believe all politicians are the same, all as bad as each other, and that suits this Prime Minister just fine. Some members opposite seem oblivious to the Prime Minister's game.
Yeah.
Some know what he's up to, but are too weak to act. But others are gleefully playing the part the Prime Minister cast for them. A minister on the radio this morning saying it's the same as a speeding ticket. No, it's not. No one has ever broken down in tears because they couldn't drive faster than 20 miles an hour outside a school. Don't insult the public with this nonsense. But, Mr. Speaker, as it happens, the last minister who got a speeding ticket and then lied about it ended up in prison, and I know because I prosecuted him. And last week, we were treated to a grotesque spectacle. One of the Prime Minister's loyal supporters accusing teachers and nurses of drinking in the staff room during lockdown. Members opposite can associate themselves with that if they want. But those of us who take pride in our NHS workers, our teachers, and every other key worker who got us through those dark days will never forget their contempt. Plenty didn't agree with every rule the Prime Minister wrote, but they followed them nonetheless. Because in this country, we respect others. We put the greater good above narrow self-interest, and we understand that the rules apply to all of us. This morning, I spoke to John Robinson, a constituent of the member for Lichfield. I want to tell you his story. When his wife died of COVID, John and his family obeyed the Prime Minister's rules. He didn't see her in hospital. He didn't hold her hand as she died. Their daughters and grandchildren drove 100 miles up the motorway, clutching a letter from the funeral director in case they were questioned by the police. They didn't have a service in the church. John's son-in-law stayed away because he would have been the forbidden seventh mourner. Doesn't the Prime Minister realise that John would have given the world to hold his dying wife's hand, even if it was just for 9 minutes? But he didn't, because he followed the Prime Minister's rules. Rules that we now know the Prime Minister blithely, repeatedly and deliberately ignored. After months of insulting excuses, today's half-hearted apology will never be enough for John Robinson. If the Prime Minister had any respect for John and the millions like him who sacrificed everything to follow the rules, he'd resign. But he won't, because he doesn't respect John. He doesn't respect the sacrifice of the British public. He is a man without shame. Looking past the member for Lichfield and the nodding dogs in the cabinet, there are many decent, honourable members on the benches opposite who do respect John Robinson, who do respect the British public. They know the damage the Prime Minister is doing. They know things can't go on as they are. And they know it's their responsibility to bring an end to this shameful chapter. Today I urge them once again, don't follow in the slipstream of an out-of-touch, out-of-control Prime Minister. Put their conscience first. Put their country first. Put John Robinson first. And remove the Prime Minister from office. Bring decency, honesty and integrity back into our politics. And stop the denigration of everything that this country stands for.
Sir William, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I apologise once again profusely to John Robinson, to all those who lost loved ones, particularly those who suffered during the pandemic. And Mr. Speaker, in my statement I have tried to explain why I spoke to the House as I did. the right honourable gentleman has chosen to respond with a series of personal attacks on me, and I understand why he does that. But I think I understand that, Mr. Speaker, but I think it would have been a good thing if, in the course of his remarks, he had addressed some of the issues that I mentioned, not least the crisis in Ukraine, with the impact that that is having on the livelihoods of everybody in this country. And it is to address that that this government will get on with our job, Mr. Speaker. It is to focus on the needs of the British people. And when he talks about nodding dogs, Mr. Speaker, I'd remind the House that there was a certain nodding dog who sat nodding in the previous Labour shadow cabinet, Mr. Speaker, that would happily have installed the honourable member for Islington North, and made, I think, a disastrous mistake in the security of our country at a very difficult time. This government will get on with the difficult job of taking us through the aftershocks of the COVID pandemic, leading not just this country, but I think the world in our response to the violence that we're seeing in Ukraine. I must say that I renew my apologies. I renew my apologies to John Robertson, to families up and down the land. But I think the best thing that we can do now for this country as politicians is not to indulge in personal abuse of the kind that we've heard, and to get on with our jobs.
Sir William Cash. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having heard the remarks both of my right honourable friend and the Leader of the Opposition, may I put it to the House that my right honourable friend...
Tory backbencher and a resolute Brexiteer going back longer than many of you may recall. The Prime Minister, the two main acts have now completed. The Prime Minister did, as we predicted, basically repeat the speech that he made on that day that he was given the fine, but he added two crucial points. One is to take away slightly from his defence, and that was when he was talking at length about his visit to Ukraine. And he said, I reassured President Zelensky of the support of this United Kingdom, which is, quotes, shared across this House, i.e. a change of leadership or even a change of government would make no difference to this. And secondly, he said, the domestic agenda needs to be addressed to make people out there safer, more secure and more prosperous. Let's go back to the House of Commons and the Prime Minister responding to Bill Cash.
Fine. I am heartily sorry for my mistake, and I accept completely the decision of the police.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let us remind ourselves that on the 8th of December last year, the Prime Minister denied that any parties happened in 10 Downing Street. They are the very same parties that the police have now fined the Prime Minister for attending. By now, people know that the rules of this House prevent me from saying that the Prime Minister deliberately and willfully misled this House. But maybe today that matters little, because the public have already made up their minds. YouGov polling shows 75% of the British public and 82% of people in Scotland have made their minds up on the Prime Minister. The public knows the difference between the truth and lying.
Hear, hear.
And they know that the Prime Minister is only apologising for one reason, and one reason only. It's the only reason he ever apologises, because he's been caught. After months of denials, his excuses have finally run out of road, and so must his time in office. The Prime Minister has broken the very laws he wrote. To try and argue that he did not know he had broken his own laws would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. Prime Minister, you can't hide behind advisers. He knows, we know, that the dogs in the street know that the Prime Minister has broken the law. This is the first Prime Minister to be officially found to have broken the law in office. A law-breaking Prime Minister. Just dwell on this. A Prime Minister who has broken the law and remains under investigation over additional law-breaking. Not just a lawbreaker, a serial offender. If he has any decency, any dignity, he would not just apologise, he would resign. Yes. Mr. Speaker, the scale and the seriousness of the issues we are all now facing demand effective leadership from a Prime Minister who can be trusted. The Tory cost of living crisis and the war crimes being inflicted on the Ukrainian people need our full focus. In a time of crisis, the very least the public deserves is a Prime Minister they can trust to tell the truth. And for this Prime Minister, that trust is broken and it can never be fixed. The truth is that a majority of people across these islands will never trust a single word he says again. So the questions today are not so much for a Prime Minister desperately clinging on to power. The real question is for Tory backbenchers. Will they finally grow a spine and remove this person from office? Or is the Tory strategy to go on about standing behind a Prime Minister who the public can't trust with the truth?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I direct the right on the jump of what I said earlier. I apologise profusely for my mistake and for what I have got wrong, and I repeat that. He asks about whether this government is capable of providing effective leadership during the current crisis and in standing up to Russia. And I would just remind him that I think it is still the policy of the Scottish National Party to dispense with this country's independent nuclear deterrent at a particularly crucial time. I don't think that's what this country needs right now.
John Whittingdale. Many of my constituents are angry about breaches which happened 2 years ago, and I welcome the Prime Minister's recognition of that and his apology. But does he agree that we currently face the gravest crisis in our global security for a long time, and it is essential that we remain focused on beating Putin and stopping the aggression against Ukraine? Can he say what additional measures we can now give to Ukraine following his discussion with President Biden and others to ensure that Putin's aggression cannot be allowed to succeed?
I thank my right honourable friend, and I repeat my apologies, my contrition. But I want to say on the state of the war in Ukraine, it's at a very perilous stage, and it is vital now that we don't allow Putin to gain momentum in the Donbass as he well could, and in the east, and that's why we are stepping up our supply of military hardware, the kind that I think the Ukrainians particularly need now. This will become an artillery conflict. They need support with more artillery. That is what we will be giving them, Mr. Speaker, in addition to many other forms of support.
Dave Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see that the Prime Minister is anxious to move on to other issues, and I think the question is, can he do that? And I will take one example. Can he perhaps explain to me, to the House and to the country, how he can credibly justify, on the one hand, calling for the resignation of the boss of P&O Ferries when he faced allegations that he broke the law, while on the other hand, refusing to resign when he himself is guilty of actually breaking the law he set?
I thank her very much, and I think that what the P&O Ferries did was entirely wrong, as I've told the House before. And I think, by the way, that I made a serious mistake, and I apologise for it very sincerely.
Mark Harper, I lost him.
Speaker, I strongly support the government's actions in standing up to Putin's aggression and helping Ukraine defend itself and our values. And it's exactly at times like this that our country needs a Prime Minister who exemplifies those values. I regret to say that we have a Prime Minister who broke the laws that he told the country they had to follow, hasn't been straightforward about it, and is now going to ask the decent men and women on these benches to defend what I think is indefensible. I'm very sorry to have to say this, but I no longer think he is worthy of the great office that he holds.
Well, I must say to my right honourable friend, I know the care and the sincerity with which he weighs his words, and I bitterly regret what has happened. I bitterly regret the event in Downing Street, as I have said. But I do believe that it is the job of this government to get on with the priorities of the British people, and that is what we're going to do.
Ed David. Speaker, a poll over the weekend asked 2,000 people what they think of the Prime Minister. The most common word they used, by far, was liar. Does the Prime Minister understand how profoundly damaging it is to our great country to have a government led by a man the public no longer trust and no longer have confidence in? Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister won't resign, will he at least give Conservative MPs on Thursday a free vote? So Conservative MPs can decide for themselves whether the Prime Minister deliberately misled Parliament or was just so incompetent that he didn't even understand his own laws.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat what I've said earlier. I disagree profoundly with what he's just said, but I repeat my apology to the House and to the country.
Jake Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Rossendale and Darwin will have weighed the words of the Prime Minister carefully, listening to them today, and they will, like me, feel that it is a contrite and wholehearted apology. They will also be looking at the action of the Prime Minister in Ukraine, and I wonder if he would consider putting Britain at the forefront of a new Marshall Plan to rebuild Ukraine after Putin has been defeated, and fund this in part by the assets confiscated by the British state from Russian oligarchs.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his excellent suggestion? It's one, indeed, that the UK government is already pursuing, and in my conversations with President Zelensky, we did discuss exactly how the supporters and friends of Ukraine around the world can help to rebuild that beautiful country when the conflict is over.
Coulter.
Mr. Speaker, we've always known, haven't we, that he was only ever sorry because he was caught banged to rights. And this latest spin about the Met having it wrong is designed to bully the Met and to provide cover to his backbenchers that haven't got the bottle to sack him. But the country has already concluded that he's either a liar or an idiot.
Sorry. I said we want temperate language. When we have the motion on Thursday, that is a different matter. For today, we're not using language like that.
Well, I withdraw the word liar, Mr. Speaker, but the electorate will have already decided. But what everybody knows is that he is a lawbreaker.
Yeah.
So if the Met have got the wrong end of the stick, why doesn't he challenge these penalties before the criminal court? Have his day in court.
I thank the honourable gentleman very much, and I just want to repeat what I said in my statement earlier, which is I fully respect the decision of the police.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Does my right honourable friend have the power to authorise Sue Gray to publish her report in full? And if so, will he use that power in order to put an end to this matter so that we do not get diverted away, as we are being, from such crucial question as supplying armaments to Ukrainian Democrats?
I thank my right honourable friend very much, but I think it very important that the Met should conclude their investigation before Sue Gray's final report.
Today marks the Prime Minister's 1000th day in office. It takes a particular type of Prime Minister to rack up as many catastrophic failures, scandals as U-turns as days on the job. From the Tory-made cost of living crisis, dodgy COVID contracts for his cronies, unlawfully proroguing Parliament, and now breaking the law. Enough is enough. So will the Prime Minister confirm if this 1000th day will be his last?
Hello. If you're listening on radio, you won't know that what we call a test card, a colour chart's just sprung up. If you're on television, I apologise for that. It means we've briefly lost the link to the House of Commons, and while the clever gremlins sort it out, the clever gremlins have sorted out. Back to Boris Johnson in the House of Commons responding to comments made in response to his speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the Prime Minister coming here today and taking full responsibility and apologising. But it is very clear, Mr. Speaker, repeatedly President Zelensky has identified the Prime Minister as Ukraine's greatest ally. He's also been identified, I think, by President Putin as enemy number one. Does the Prime Minister agree that this isn't a bad accolade to have? And doesn't he also agree that months of psychodrama in here would play into the hands of the latter, not the former?
I think it's very important, Mr. Speaker, that the people of this country should understand. Although the country is faced with massive issues that we have to deal with, the aftershocks of COVID and the war in Ukraine, I in no way minimise the importance of the fine I have received, and I apologise wholeheartedly.
Mick Whitley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think people across the House would agree that the situation in Ukraine is a very serious one, and there's no doubt we fully support what's going on and what we're trying to do. But setting that aside for a minute, the Prime Minister stands before us today as the first resident of number 10 to be found guilty of breaking the law while serving in public office. And while he's finally apologised today, it's been accompanied by the absurd caveat that the man who set the rules couldn't understand them. Will the Prime Minister concede that him remaining in office would deal a grievous blow to the rule of law in this country? And for the first time in his career, will he put the national interest before his personal ambition and resign?
Thank you very much. I repeat my apology. I direct him to what I've said earlier on, and I think what the people of this country need is us focusing on their issues and their priorities, and that's what the government is going to do.
Colin Brazier.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for the update he's given this afternoon on the energy security strategy, and particularly for the support that this offers for steel. It is the latest in a long line of support that the Prime Minister has brought forward. It also sets out plans on wind, solar and nuclear. Does he agree with me that the best possible place to make the steel needed for these projects is right here in the UK?
Yes, and she is completely right, and that's why our energy security strategy is so absolutely vital, not just for consumers but also for British industry.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new poll shows 3/4 of the public think the Prime Minister deliberately lied about breaking lockdown rules. Yet on Thursday, the Prime Minister will order his MPs to stop his law-breaking ever coming before the Privileges Committee. If the Prime Minister has nothing to hide, why doesn't he do the straightforward thing and refer himself to the Privileges Committee? What's the Prime Minister scared of?
Mr. Speaker, the House will decide.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for coming to the House at the earliest opportunity to update us on this situation. On Thursday, sir, following your announcements this morning, this House has got to decide whether to refer the Prime Minister to the Privileges Committee. There is only one issue. Did the Prime Minister deliberately mislead the House? Could I ask the Prime Minister, did you deliberately mislead the House at the dispatch box?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Sammy Wilson.
Prime Minister, there will be millions of angry people across the United Kingdom today, even after the apology which has been given here today, who will still remain angry because of what they've gone through. But I think that any objective listener today will recognise that, for whatever reason, the apology given today was a genuine apology, and that we now need. I would also remind the Prime Minister there are hundreds of thousands of unionists in Northern Ireland who are angry about other things as well that happened. But rather than focus on the past, I think it is important we focus on the future. And the Prime Minister has said that he discussed today the situation in Ukraine with world leaders. That situation is becoming very desperate. What discussions has he had about giving the appropriate weaponry to the Ukrainian forces so that they can drive back the Russians, liberate their country, and avoid all of the consequences, whether it's in terms of our economy, oil, or food for the rest of the world?
I thank him very much, and as he knows, the UK is in continuous discussion with the Ukrainians about what we can do to help them defend themselves, and a lot has gone, a lot more will be going. While I'm at it, I want to pay tribute to a particular Northern Ireland business, used to be Short Brothers, now Thales, that has been absolutely indispensable, as he knows, in helping the Ukrainians against Russian armour.
John Barron.
Mr. Speaker, the government and British people have provided extensive support to Ukrainian refugees, but there remain in Afghanistan around 200 British Council contractors, many of whom are fleeing from the Taliban. I'm awaiting a meeting with the refugee minister, one that was promised back in November. Will he use his good offices to speed that meeting along?
I thank him very much, and yes, of course, and those 200 contractors for the British Council should, I believe, automatically be eligible, and certainly should be able to come under the scheme that we put in place, but I'll make sure he gets the meeting he wants.
Yeah. Chris Brown.
So the Prime Minister responding there to John Barron, Member of Parliament there, talking about other issues. And that is Chris Bryant, who is the Labour Member of Parliament for Rwanda and a former chair of the Privileges Committee. At risk of being told off by my bosses in my ear, let's hear Chris Bryant, former chair of the Privileges Committee. Can we go back to the House of Commons?
No, to be war crimes. But many of these worst atrocities are being committed by sociopaths working as mercenaries, paid for by the Russian government, by the Russian state, but nonetheless working as mercenaries. The UK still isn't a signatory to the Convention on Mercenaries. Isn't it time we put a stop to this terrible barbarity, not just in Ukraine, but in other places in the world where mercenaries from the Wagner Group operate with sociopathic intent?
I thank him very much, and I thank the right honourable. I will study his proposal on mercenaries, and I say to him that I think he's been right for a long time on Russia, and he's been vindicated.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard the fulsome apology by the Prime Minister, but what he is doing is taking a lead in Ukraine, and what he needs to do, if I may suggest, is keep giving Ukraine defensive weapons so that we can eventually drag President Putin and the Russian Federation to a peace agreement, and then would he lead the world in gaining reparations so that that great country can be rebuilt again.
I thank him very much, and I thank him for his staunch position on Ukraine. He's completely right. I'm afraid that there is now no easy way of finding a diplomatic or a negotiated solution. I know the House would have preferred that, but I think it's going to be very difficult, as it were, to construct an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin. And we are now in a logic where we must simply do everything we can collectively to ensure that Vladimir Putin fails, and fails comprehensively, in Ukraine.
Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The majority of my constituents are sickened and furious that the Prime Minister broke the laws that they followed, putting their lives on hold, missing out on big life events, and even losing the chance to say goodbye to loved ones, to protect the NHS and save lives. Does the Prime Minister agree with my constituent, Robert, who believes that lawbreakers should not be lawmakers.
Mr. Speaker, I apologise profusely particularly to all those who lost loved ones, and I know how painful it has been. But I repeat what I've said. I believe that the job of the government now is to get on with delivering on the priorities of the country at a difficult time.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the Prime Minister has offered his wholehearted apology for the fixed penalty notice he received, which I very much welcome. But can I encourage the Prime Minister not to take any lectures from the Labour Party opposite, bearing in mind the number of FPNs their previous cabinet received, and yes, speed does kill. Yes. Or, of course, on this occasion, the FPNs that the Labour Party and SNP did not receive. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that everybody should be equal under the law?
Well, yeah, of course I agree with that, Mr. Speaker. But the issue here today, let's be frank, is what I did and what I got wrong, and I renew my apologies.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister accepted the Health Secretary's resignation for breaking guidance, COVID guidance, not COVID laws. The Prime Minister then accepted Allegra Stratton's resignation for joking that the parties that were so frequent in Downing Street were actually a business event. He's now using her joke as his defence. Why is he holding himself to lower standards than he held the people whose resignations he accepted to?
Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that I apologise for what I got wrong, and I've explained to the House why I spoke in the House as I did. And what I want to do is to get on with the job of the government in taking this country forward, and that is what we're going to do.
Baker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I dare say that every member of this House can bring to mind their own John Robinson, perhaps several. And though you would not know it, I also think that most members of this House know that justice and mercy and humility also go hand in hand, a fact known by many who watch these proceedings too. In asking us to forgive him on behalf of all of those John Robinsons we represent, my right honourable friend could not have made a more humble apology. But what I want to say to him is that justice leading into mercy relies on a very, very old-fashioned concept, and that is repentance. What assurance can he give us that nothing of this kind will ever happen again?
I thank him for what he has said, and I'm heartily sorry, as I have said, and I wish it had not happened, and I wish that things had been totally different. What I have already done, as the House will know, is taken steps to change the way we do things in number 10. But that in itself is not enough. I accept full responsibility myself for my actions.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's supposed apology to the nation is pathetic. He told bereaved families in Downing Street last year that he had done everything possible to save their loved ones. Now he's been fined for breaking his own laws, illustrating just how soft the Tories have become on crime. And does the Prime Minister accept his words ring hollow for those of us who have lost the loved ones?
I repeat what I've said, and I know that the honourable gentleman has experienced bereavement during the pandemic, and I'm sorry for his loss, and I repeat my apologies for what happened in number 10.
Michael Fabricant.
Mr. Speaker, I was desperately sad to hear about my constituent John Robinson. My own best friend, his mother died in hospital, and he wasn't able to see her. And I do recall, of course, that the Prime Minister's mother also died during that COVID crisis. We've all suffered from these heart-wrenching tragedies, and none of us should forget it. But I just want to ask a quick question, if I may, regarding the Ukraine. The Prime Minister has announced that he's going to provide new modern mobile ground-to-air missile systems. How will we be able to train the Ukrainians during this war situation so that they can be put into use before it's too late?
I thank my right honourable friend, and I repeat my condolences to his friend. And I just to tell him on the Starstreak and other systems that we're using, that we're supplying to the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are now being trained, as he can imagine, outside the immediate theatre of conflict.
Murray Rimmer.
That was the Prime Minister responding to Michael Fabricant, the Member of Parliament for Lichfield, and what political observers might say is a serial supporter of the Prime Minister. And we're going to come away from that because we're off air in about 15 minutes' time, and we want to offer you some analysis of what you heard there. I gave some brief passing comments about what the Prime Minister himself had said, and that important concession that the entire United Kingdom is supported across the House of Commons in support of the Ukrainian people. But in Sir Keir Starmer's response to the Prime Minister, there was a crucial line within it, and he said it is now time for members opposite to do the honourable thing and get rid of this Prime Minister. Hold that thought. That's the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, in effect saying, we can't get rid of him. The only people, as we said right at the beginning of these 2 hours, that can get rid of him, if that is their view, until there's a general election when it's up to you, me and everybody else, are the Tory MPs. Up came the Tory MPs. Mark Harper, former Chief Whip. The Prime Minister is a lawbreaker I can no longer defend. I no longer think he is worthy of that great office. Up came John Whittingdale, former Culture Secretary, sacked by Johnson. I back him. Let's talk about Ukraine. Jake Berry, one of the rising stars, a Red Wall MP, saying he is contrite, I accept it. Let's now move on to a Marshall Plan, the economics of rebuilding Ukraine. And finally, Steve Baker as well. Apologies need to be humble, and they need to also construct repentance. Can he now tell us he will never do this again? So Keir Starmer's invitation to the Conservative Party to get rid of the Prime Minister on that basis is losing 3-1. As things stand. Delighted to be joined by Darren McCaffrey, now our political editor, who has been watching all of that from start to finish. Big gauntlets thrown down and big response from some of Boris Johnson's previous big enemies.
Yeah, indeed. Much of what we heard today, Alistair, we had been expecting. I think, as you had noted earlier on, it was essentially what we heard last week in Chequers when the Prime Minister had received that fine, i.e. I'm terribly sorry, very contrite, apologising, saying it will not happen again. But in the end, the government, the country needs to go on and focus on other big issues, he would suggest, whether that be the cost of living crisis or indeed clearly what is happening in Ukraine. So it comes to what was the most notable thing we heard from that, and that was, as you've also rightly pointed out, Mark Harper, the former Chief Whip, another Conservative MP, to publicly essentially say the Prime Minister needs to go. He said that I regret to say the Prime Minister broke the law. He said it was indefensible, essentially, what he did. I no longer think he's worthy of the great office he holds. And he subsequently tweeted out, Alistair, a letter that he sent 5 days ago to Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, in which he is calling, essentially, for a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister. Again, as you've rightly pointed out, that can only be brought about by Conservative MPs, effectively. So where does this leave us all? Well, it leaves us with Conservative MPs overwhelmingly giving their backing to the Prime Minister. They clearly feel the situation has moved on. They clearly feel the Prime Minister is sorry. They clearly feel that, as one MP, I think Tom Humm pointed out, that President Zelensky views Britain as a great ally, and additionally, as Vladimir Putin sees Boris Johnson as number one enemy, that is reason to keep the Prime Minister in situ. All I would add to this, though, is that I don't think the Prime Minister is out of the woods yet. That was still quite a difficult session for Boris Johnson, repeatedly having to apologise. It's fair to say Keir Starmer's speech was quite effective in many regards, particularly noting the personal sacrifice that many people had made. And I think for the fear for number 10 of a few things, first of all, we've got local elections in a couple of weeks' time. They could prove very, very difficult for the Conservative Party. But additionally, this might not be the end of it. We could see the Prime Minister back here doing exactly the same again in a couple of weeks' time. He may have to do it another time and another time. I mean, it is possible that the Prime Minister could be fined not just once, not twice, not 3 times, maybe as many as 4 times. And under those circumstances, will the same MP stand up and be prepared to defend the Prime Minister, or will there be a sense that the public mood, the mood within the party, has switched yet again?
Darren, brilliant analysis, as always. Thank you very much indeed for having listened so carefully to the debate and for finding some time for us there. Darren McCaffrey, our political editor. Sitting in the studio with me, Lynn May, who's been here from the very outset. And you were listening, I was watching you occasionally, as intently as I was, not exclusively to what the Prime Minister was saying, but who popped up and who said what. What was your take on that? Because it was a big gamble. He'd no idea who the Speaker would select, and he'd no idea what they were going to say.
As much as at the moment I can't support the Prime Minister, I think the opposition and people like Ian Blackford need to be really careful. He was fervent in accusing the Prime Minister of breaking the rules when he drove 600 miles himself. However, I do agree that it sets a precedent.
Yeah.
Why should it be different for me?
Yeah.
Laws moving forward. And for those at home, I understand why there is some support for Boris, because many of us thought these rules are ridiculous, but we still did them. The difference is, between the Prime Minister and us, he enforced those laws. He was the face of those laws. And he should, as the leader, be the one that we look to lead the way.
All right.
And he broke them.
Lynn, great to meet you, and thank you for all of your time.
No
Look forward to
problem.
seeing you again.
Likewise.
Welcome anytime. Lynn May there, who has been good enough to be with me for the whole 2 hours. We're going to go back to College Green now to conclude our conversation on what has just happened in the last couple of pretty dramatic hours in the House of Commons. And as Darren said, don't forget, local elections are taking place in just a couple of weeks' time. Reform UK, New Kids on the Block, you might say, will be fielding around 120 candidates, as well as a candidate in the Wakefield by-election, which has been triggered by the resignation of Imran Ahmed. And leader of that party, Richard Tice, is standing there ready to join us. What an intriguing afternoon. I don't want to ask you anything about Partygate. I want to ask you quite specifically, because we discussed this last time you and I had a natter, the Prime Minister saying now is the time to focus on the real concerns and interests and prosperity of the British people. Was he convincing? Was he persuasive on that point?
I don't think at all, actually, to be honest. I don't think he was at all persuasive. He's had a very difficult session. Keir Starmer and Ian Blackford, I think, made life very uncomfortable for him. There was a massive difference between what the majority of the Tory MPs are doing in supporting the Prime Minister and public opinion. I think in a couple of weeks' time, the public have their first chance to express a view, and I think that will be crystal clear and not in favour. And it's quite clear that there is no prosperity going on in the United Kingdom. We have a cost of living crisis, we have an energy crisis, and we have a government that is completely misreading how difficult life is for everybody. They've got the opportunity to cut taxes, to create growth. They're not, they're raising taxes. They've got the opportunity to use our own treasure, our own shale gas. They're not doing that. And I think over the coming months, the public will express an increasing view that this government is completely out of touch.
But in one word, he wants to haul it back to the economy. You want to haul it back to the economy. That's at the pounding heart of British politics now.
Correct. And many people are suffering hugely.
Yeah. Richard, I'd said one word, correct, you said, which was brilliant.
This government.
We'll talk again, maybe at the weekend. Thank you very much indeed for your time there. Richard Tice there from Reform UK, reflecting with me on what the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer and other parliamentarians had to say. Thank you so much for being with me. I will be here again tomorrow, and then it'll be Colin for the rest of the week, but for the rest of the week. But for now, from all of us here, thanks for joining us on GB News TV and radio, and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Hello again, I'm Stephen Keats with your latest Met Office update. Over the next 24 hours, we'll see showers generally fading away, some clear spells tonight, but then for many places it will be a warmer day tomorrow with more sunshine. Now, for the last couple of hours, we've seen those showers building across parts of England and Wales, a few heavy ones now. Some showers too for the western Northern Ireland, western Scotland. I think for the western Northern Ireland, as well as parts of central southern England into the West Country, the odd sharper shower through this evening, the odd rumble of thunder possible. But the showers fading away as we move on into the early hours of Wednesday morning. Clear spells for many places across England and Wales, variable amounts of cloud. The clearest weather probably across parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland, but a few fog patches for Northern Ireland, and a touch of frost in the countryside, particularly for northern Britain. That's underneath this ridge of high pressure, which will increasingly dominate the weather, I think, as we move through Wednesday. These fronts in the west not really making that much in the way of inroads. So for some of us, it will be a chilly start into Wednesday morning, but the frost soon lifting underneath the strong April sunshine. And then for many places, where we've got bits of cloud first thing, that'll tend to break up. Elsewhere, a few patches of cloud developing, but for many places, it will be a day of more sunshine compared to what we've seen today. Just 1 or 2 showers for parts of Wales and western England. And for many places, it will be warmer, although cooler along that east coast with the breeze coming in off the sea. Now, skipping ahead towards Thursday, and not a great deal of change all in all. A bit more cloud perhaps coming in from the east through the day, particularly affecting some eastern coasts of both northeast Scotland and northeast England. Elsewhere, again, sunny spells, areas of cloud milling around from time to time, but a predominantly dry picture with temperatures in the mid-teens. For the end of the week, then, we've got low pressure down towards the south, bringing some very disturbed weather to parts of Spain, France and the western Mediterranean. High pressure to the north, and the net effect of that is brisk easterly flow across the UK, which will bring in air that's not desperately cold, but when it's coming in off the North Sea, feeding in quite a bit of cloud as well. So eastern areas generally cloudier, western areas generally sunniest, and western areas also warmest. Take care.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well.